All right, we are live with our turf chat on this incredible spring weather we've been having. Before we get into any of that, I would like to talk about our industry partners. We wouldn't be able to do these broadcasts without these industry partners. So take a look at this sign, and as we always say, please remember to support those who support you. When you're making those purchasing decisions, these are the companies that help make the entire chapter possible, and certainly broadcast like this. If you would like to participate in the turf chat and have any questions for us, you can email me at info@migcsa.org. You can tag us on Twitter at MIGCSA. Either one of those will get to me. You can send me a text if you have my cell phone number, 231-714-7365. Those are all the ways to get a hold of us. So please participate. If you have any questions, I'll make sure and ask them either during the presentation or after. Those are all the ways to get a hold of us. So please. All right. Dr. Andresen, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
I will.
So please. All right. Dr. Andresen, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Be happy.
Sorry about that. I had a little bit, I had the live screen going as well, so I was getting a little reverb. This should be much better. Dr. Andresen, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and start with your presentation, and I will mute my mic so I don't jump over you again.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Jeff Andresen. I'm a professor here at MSU in East Lansing, and I teach weather and climate. And my specialty area is really impacts of weather and climate on agriculture, and here to provide an overseason or early growing season at least review, look in the rear view mirror a little bit, and then also look ahead. Well, on a on a very unspring-like day for most of you, if not all of you, on the call, at least those in the region here. The image I chose, if you're wondering what that is, it's called a shelf cloud, and this is at Ludington on the waterfront down near the harbor in Ludington on the 1st of June. And the shelf cloud is a response. It's a airflow outflow of a thunderstorm. In this case, a fairly strong thunderstorm as it approached from the west. And I think it says it's a fairly. I chose it for a reason, and that is because we've had a very, very, very active spring season here thus far, and I'll follow up on that. I'm gonna talk about. I'm actually gonna go back to the winter, say a couple things about that, and then the spring so far, and then we'll end with some outlooks here, both in the short and the medium, and then in the longer term. Looking back though, starting with the winter, December through February, so 2018 through February of 2019. The winter actually got off to a late start. It was unusually mild during much of December into the first week or so of January, and then things changed drastically. We had a couple of Arctic air outbreaks. I'll show an example of one of those here in just a second. But if we take the mean statistics, and on the left here, you've got average temperature departure from normal for that 3-month period. And you can see that it generally the average temperatures, and they averaged out between the beginning and the end of the winter, because the end of the winter was certainly colder than normal, but near normal in far southern parts of the state. And you can see not too far away across the Ohio Valley, it was actually milder than normal in the winter. But as you go north and west, our mean temperatures decreased, and were by the time you get up to the UP, we're significantly colder than normal for the winter season. Precipitation in most areas. This is percent expressed in percent of normal. Most of the states saw above normal precipitation, the exception being the far southeastern corner of the state, where it was just slightly below normal. So for most of us, it was cooler and wetter than normal, and that's certainly a theme as we move forward. I'll get to that in a second. The statistics sometimes don't tell the whole story, at least looking at means. And what you're seeing here for Muskegon, which is fairly representative of the state, these are daily temperatures going all the way back to last summer, and then through the course of the year. And the red values are those above normal. Those in blue are below normal, of course. But interesting to look back at, again, at the fall and the winter. You can see that we had last year, and it's also worth noting this because many of you watch the weather carefully. But last growing season, last summer, turned out to be one of the warmest on record, especially if you look at the not just the June, July, August, but also go back to the spring and then into the fall. And you can see that here in Muskegon. If we look at, this is June, July, August, September, above normal temperatures all the way through into the beginning of October. And if you look at heat degree, growing degree day accumulations, heat accumulation, last year, depending on location, it was at least one of the, if not the record largest accumulation, heat accumulation for a growing season. So unusually warm growing season in 2018. We then had some cooler weather during the month of October. In November, we actually had a little bit of a taste of winter, an early onset of winter. That was replaced quickly, though, by warmer than normal weather during December, which persisted, as I said, into the beginning of January. And then we had a couple of Arctic outbreaks, and you can see both of those here where I've got my cursor. There were a few thaws here, periods of warmer than normal weather, but by and large, for most of the state, we remained on the negative side or below normal side here all the way through the rest of the winter, and then, of course, continuing on into the spring. On the right-hand side here, a couple things. One is we've got ice cover across the Great Lakes. It started off here in the again in the month of December below normal, but then with the Arctic air that came in January, quickly expanded to above normal. The green is the normal, the blue is the weekly accumulation for that given week, and you can see that ice cover over the lakes was greater than normal for the remainder of the season. So as the season as a whole, there was more ice than normal. Down below here, this is an interesting time lapse put together by Deke Arndt at the National Centers for Environmental Information, and with a very, very, very active storm track through the upper Midwest, many times through the state of Michigan itself, there was a very, very deep snowpack across much of the area. This is especially true in the Upper Peninsula and then west into northern Wisconsin and into the northern half of Minnesota. But with this thaw, it's actually this area right here, this period right here, we had rapid thawing of the snowpack, and there were several inches of water equivalent, as you can see depicted here, as much as maybe 10 inches of water equivalent in the snowpack in portions of upper Michigan. And within really a matter of days, but certainly within about a 10-day period, a 2-week period, almost all of it had melted. And this helps explain why the Great Lakes right now are at record, near or even above record levels for this time of the year. A lot of the runoff went, of course, directly right into the lake. I want to say a couple things. We'll go back one more time. There were 2 Arctic air outbreaks, one in the 3rd week of January, the other in the last couple days of January that impacted all of us. One was fairly noteworthy for the region. These are extreme minimum temperatures for the winter, and you can see, well, a couple things you can see here. One is that it was much worse as you went west into Wisconsin, Minnesota, even Illinois and Iowa, where many areas saw -40 Fahrenheit, which we don't see as often anymore as we used to in past years. Oh, if you're wondering what the light green is here, I use this for actually for the blueberry growers. So we had some winter injury or winter damage, and that's what you're looking at there. So you can disregard that, but the other colors are all the same. You can also clearly here, though, see the shadowing, the influence of certainly of Lake Michigan on these extreme minimum temperatures. With one exception, down here in the southwest corner, you'll note that we had some very cold temperatures, some even reaching into the mid -20s, which is pretty unusual for southwestern lower Michigan, but it had to do with airflow across the lakes with the second Arctic air outbreak, again, which occurred on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of the month of January. And that's what I've got here. The next image shows you it's really interesting to see this, another lake moderation or example of lake effect. These are temperatures at the surface, and then we've also got the little wind barbs here are wind vectors. They show the direction and the strength of the wind and the direction it's coming from. So you can see during the middle of this Arctic air outbreak on the 31st of January, we had a westerly wind, at least across Lake Michigan, with much warmer temperatures. At that point in time, there wasn't that much ice on Lake Michigan or Lake Superior or Erie for that matter. And you can see that airflow as it makes its way into the state, it slows down and piles up. But down in the southwest corner down here, you can see winds are not out of the west, they're actually out of the southwest. And that's where the center of this really cold air mass was just to our west. And so we actually got some of the coldest air from the southwest. And that's pretty atypical for these types of outbreaks. Here's a little close-up of that to show you a little bit better idea. But look at the difference in temperature here, extremes from -20 down to, well, maybe -5, at least 10, 15, even 20 degrees Fahrenheit difference just because of the wind flow off the lakes. And another reminder of how important the lakes are in our daily weather and in our climate, how much they modify things, at least in the winter when there's no ice on them. So things could have been much, much worse. It was a very cold, these extremes were very cold in most areas to our west and certainly for the Upper Peninsula, but it could have been worse without the lakes. Moving ahead and shifting to the spring season, well, guess what? More repeat, cooler and wetter than normal. Looking at mean temperatures here, generally from 2 to as much as 4 or even 5 degrees Fahrenheit below normal. That's a pretty significant departure climatologically. It's up probably in the well, maybe in the 20 coolest springs on record. It was also wetter than normal. Again, a very, very active storm track through the middle of the country led to lots of precipitation and repeated chances of precipitation with a series of low pressure systems that came through the region. You can see some parts here in the Midwest, and Michigan's really on the northeastern fringe of this area that was most well impacted by this pattern. You can see portions of the central Great Plains 300% of normal. That's really hard to do for a 3-month period. But this year it has been an unusually persistent type of weather pattern, and it actually continues in some ways to the present time or the current time. If we look at this on a longer term basis from the beginning of the year, and this is what you see right now, the observed precipitation across the state ranging from about 13 or 14 inches in portions of the thumb and off to our east to more than 25 inches in portions of southwestern lower and the northern upper peninsulas. And you can see that off to our south and west again. Just extraordinary precipitation totals here, expressed in a percentage here from the beginning of the year. Generally in that 110, 120% range to more than 150%, to even more than 200% of normal up in the UP. And in terms of the timing of this, one more, this is a daily accumulation of precipitation, again, going back to last summer to June. And I wanted to have the whole year here because remember, and we actually talked about this in one of these webinars, we had drought conditions over many portions of Michigan and the Great Lakes region here last summer. That was abruptly, and abruptly with an underline or bold here, ended during the middle of August. We had several inches of rainfall over it, and again, Muskegon is representative here, but that's where you see this rapid accumulation of precipitation to go above normal. The wetter than normal pattern continued for much of last fall, and then as this accumulated, observed accumulations here run parallel to the normals, which means we're pretty much accumulating what we should. But earlier this spring, in the month of March and even into February, you can see once again we're accumulating more precipitation than normally occurs. So 2 areas of especially or periods that were wetter than normal. The other issue about this is not only the surplus here. Note 12.5 inches of water surplus, and again the average annual precipitation in much of Michigan's on the order, well, it's the low to mid 30s, let's call it for this part of the state, but that's a huge surplus for that period in time. Down below, I think in the next one here, the other thing to note about this is it wasn't just the amount of precipitation, we also had many wet days. And what you see here for Detroit, this is a 30-day sequence. Actually, this is a 90-day sequence, sorry. Same thing, format, just a lesser time frame. But on the bottom here, you see the days with precipitation. And to give you an example, at my house in Hazlitt, just to the east and north of East Lansing, during the month of May, I recorded 4.07 inches of total precipitation. That's about 7/10 of an inch above normal, and that's not that big a deal. It's certainly wetter than normal, but it's not extraordinary. But it fell on 23 days. I had 23 days in May with rainfall, including 12 consecutive days at the end of the month. That's very, very unusual. And the normal number of wet days in a month in our part of the state, generally on the order to 10 to 12. So almost double the number of wet days. Similar, but not quite as extreme during April. And in June, unfortunately, we're also following the same pattern. So it wasn't just the amounts, it was the frequency of precipitation that was also very, very unusual. And all of this, of course, this is a no-brainer, has resulted in unusual conditions across the landscape. What you're looking at here are rankings of calculated soil moisture. This is a model estimated soil moisture, but it's not too far off from reality over the landscape, looking at the month of May as a whole. And the reason I wanted to bring this in here is because we've got a 99th percentile. Most of Michigan, you can see well within the 90th percentile, and some, including upper Michigan, is in the 99th. So that is, at least in terms of soil, and this is looking at the top 5 feet of the soil profile collectively, it's the wettest it's been on record. That's hard to do, but it's a reflection of all of this, well, not just a heavy precip, but also cooler than normal temperatures, lower than normal evapotranspiration rates. The other thing I didn't mention, but has also been true here, we've had almost no hot days. Locally here, for example, in East Lansing, we've only had 3 days where it's reached 80 degrees for a maximum temperature. That's unusual. We've had no 90-degree days that I'm aware of in the state, but it hasn't been really, really cold or really, really cool, but the daytime temperatures have been cooler. And the other issue here also is important to know for you, our soil temperatures have lagged below normal for much of the growing season. That both because they're wet and it takes a lot of energy to evaporate water, and as well as the normal to below normal mean temperatures. So all of those have led to a very, very delayed start to things. Degree day totals, not surprisingly here, are below normal virtually for the entire state and really region wide. These are the totals here through yesterday, base 50. And this is starting on the beginning of March, so the totals reflecting the season thus far. The more interesting graphic, I think, is here on the right. These are the degree day accumulations compared with our normal, expressed in terms of calendar days. And the pattern you see here is actually not quite as extreme as it was over the last couple of weeks, but our departures range from maybe a couple days in the far southern part of the state to more than 2 weeks as you go north in the state. And that pattern has generally been the case here for almost all the growing seasons. Again, the delays, phenological delays, are greater the farther north in the state you go. Well, one of the questions we've had, and there are many, many questions about this crazy weather, but are there any other years that have been similar to this year? And one of my associates here in the climate office looked up some years, and we came up, since 1951, we came up with 7 years which had persistent, cool and wetter than normal months during the spring season. And I apologize, my phone is ringing here. Hope it'll go to voicemail here in a second. But those analog years are 56, 73, and 74, 83 and 84, 1996, and 2011. And it's interesting to note that there's a couple consecutive years in both the 70s and the 80s. And we looked subsequent to that, what happened after those years, and it was a variety of things. It was all over the board. But at least in one of these years, 1983, and this is sort of a caveat for later, we talk about the outlook, we did go from unusually cool and wet to hot and dry during them. So that certainly is a possibility. Again, that occurred in 1983. But some of these other ones, the summer that followed the spring, at least in a couple cases, was wetter than normal. Another thing to note here too that's I think is interesting, and that is the number of cooler and wetter than normal months, March, April, and May in the spring season. The frequency of those types of departures has increased in the last decade. That's something else that shows up. So these cool, wet months in the spring are relatively more frequent than they have been in the past. That's again, depending on your weather vulnerability, that is an issue for many folks. Well, let's look ahead. And I'm going to move to our current surface map, and we've got a weather system, as many of you appreciate right now. That's very, very early summer-like. This is something we would see much even late winter or early spring. It's an area of low pressure here over southeastern lower Michigan, and it's in response to a big upper air trough across the Great Lakes, and of course the troughs, when they're over us, lead to certainly to cooler than normal conditions, but this one is really, again, a late cold season type of weather system. Radar, this is an earlier radar pic down here in the lower right, but light to moderate rain with some embedded thunder over most of the state. The bad news is that's we've got another several hours of this before this system makes its way off into Ontario to the north and east. One other thing about this is there will be winds, pretty strong northwesterly winds, sorry, that develop on the back side of this. But the system should be out and gone by this evening in far eastern parts of the state, and we should get fairly rapid clearing from west to east across the state, which sets us up for tomorrow. Most of the state will see high pressure and actually a little bit of a respite, fair and noticeably warmer. By the way, our high temperatures today on Thursday only keep staying in the 50s, and that is almost probably 20 degrees below normal where they should be for this time of year, especially for the central and southern parts of the state. We may set a few records for the all-time coolest maximum temperature for the day. So if it seems unusual, it really is. It's off near the edge of the chart. The next weather system to impact us after today, it's a frontal boundary up here along the U.S.-Canadian border. That's going to move off to the south and east here beginning tomorrow afternoon and then into the weekend. And by Saturday, you can see as it approaches, there will be another threat of rainfall, or the next threat of rainfall, once again beginning in the northwest, and it'll start in the far western part of the UP tomorrow afternoon, and then overspread the rest of the state during the evening, and continue Saturday, and probably, as it looks like right now, into Sunday as well. Good news about this one, though, the amounts with rainfall amounts with this probably will be limited, and I think the aerial coverage will be somewhat less than we've seen in recent events. So that's the next chance. After this system moves through, we should see fair and drier weather for the beginning of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and with any luck, Wednesday as well. But right now, the next chance after Saturday, Sunday timeframe, probably late next week. Thursday would be a good guess. And at this point, it's still looking like an active weather pattern by the end of next week into next weekend. So a number of wet days and certainly opportunities of rain for the latter part of next week and into the following week. Rain gauge, how much rain is predicted or forecast here for the next week. This is through next Thursday morning. You can see a fairly strong north to south gradient with as little as half an inch in the far northern part of the state to more than an inch along the southern border. And this pattern, this map we could have used last week, we could have used 3 weeks ago, because it's just a reflection of the same upper air pattern that we've been stuck in. And you can see just to our south in Ohio and Indiana, in some cases more than maybe 3 inches of rain possible. And that, for that reason, the greatest threat of rainfall, greatest threat of precip will be definitely across southern parts of the state here, at least for the foreseeable future, but certainly for the next, or for the upcoming week. Going into the medium range, the jet stream forecast is here illustrated on the left side, and the same upper air pattern that's we've seen over and over for the last couple months is still there. That's the bottom line. There's a split flow with a ridge over western Canada, and then below it in the subtropical branch, or the southern branch of the jet stream, you've got a trough, and that means again an active weather pattern through the Midwest. With any hope, a lot of the precipitation will remain to our south, or at least the worst of the precipitation will remain to our south. But as you can see here, reflected in the mean temperatures and precipitation totals, cooler and wetter than normal is forecast to persist. Again, it's a broken record over and over. Same is true for the 8 to 14 day outlook, which takes us through the 26th of the month. I would note that looking at the medium range forecast guidance, there's some hints of maybe some moderation or a change by very late in the month of June, but it's pretty safe to say right now that June will likely go into the books, certainly cooler and wetter than normal given the persistence of this pattern. For the month as a whole, and I bring this up here because it sets a stage for our 3-month outlook, but the Climate Prediction Center at NOAA, when they issued the June outlook, there were two major issues, but the biggest issue is the fact that so much of the central and eastern part of the country has been excessively wet, and that's actually taken into account in the long lead outlooks. And this cooler than normal area out here across the central Great Plains is actually a reflection of that, because it takes huge amounts of energy to vaporize and evaporate water rather than directly heat the landscape, and that's what you're seeing there reflected. In terms of precipitation, you see it, well, at least for Michigan, both mean temperatures and precipitation in this EC, that stands for equal chances of below, near, and above normal categories. So essentially, for the month, they predicted no direction, although it's very, very likely going to end up on the cooler and wetter than normal side before all is said and done. But that was the official outlook issued here in mid-May. As we look out beyond, in addition to the wet landscape issue, there is still an El Nino in progress out in the equatorial Pacific, but it's only weak in intensity, and usually the stronger the El Nino or the La Nina event, the more likely we are to see weather anomalies here in the mid-latitudes in our part of the world. But the forecast, in essence, these are warmer than normal sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. They are projected to continue for the rest of the summer, into the fall, and even into the calendar year, which means, again, a continuation of a really weak El Nino event. So that's playing a significant role in our long lead outlook. Here's our June through August official, and you can see it's a little bit like the June outlook, but modified. Michigan is in an area in between, an area forecast to be cooler than normal to our west and warmer than normal to our east, and we're right on the gradient or boundary between those two. So it's a little iffy, or little, at least in terms of temperature. You can also see that normal to above normal precipitation is forecast for much of, well, certainly much of the Midwest, including at least portions of southern and central lower Michigan. And the cooler and wetter than normal scenario is one that we typically associate with El Nino events during the summer, not the winter. That's usually mild and dry, but during the summer we typically see a little cooler and wetter, and that's some of what you're seeing there. And as we move on beyond that, looking collectively, this is going way out to summer of next year, but the outlook suggests the late summer and fall, even into the winter, will tend to be warmer than normal. So some recovery or some change from where we have been. And for precipitation, most of it is in the equal chances, the EC category, with no direction on precip. So summarizing here, cooler and wetter, boy, it just, we say this over and over and over again, we've been stuck in a very, very persistent pattern for really the late winter all the way through the present. It's left things way behind where they typically are for this time of the year, but it's an extremely unusual spring, to say the least. Our forecast guidance suggests more of the same, at least for the short and medium range for the next couple of weeks, but then possibly some changes beyond that for the middle and latter part of the summer into the fall, with at least a warmer weather forecast by then. And with that, I'll wrap up and see if anybody has questions or discussions, or Adam, I'll stop sharing here at least momentarily so we can, and I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you for that. I think I can just see everybody watching this going, "Oh, I wish he would have had better news than that." But the one thing to Jeff's credibility is he picked this date because he knew it was going to rain. So thank you for that, Jeff. You're very, very good. One question I had, so the reason for the spring, you talked about the El Nino pattern. Did anybody see this coming over last fall, over the winter? And I don't know if it's because of the El Nino, but is this kind of a surprise or is this somewhat expected?
It actually was not. This El Nino formed way back in the fall of 2018. And so our outlook at the time with El Nino events in the winter season are typically milder and drier than normal. Well, December was that direction, but definitely not for the latter half. So it's been going on since then. But again, I think the important issue is that it's relatively weak, and those weak events just don't have as much of an influence on our weather patterns here. And it influences the jet stream flow, which of course is why we see changes once in a while. But so it's been going on for a while. It's not it's not unusual for one to continue that long, but most times those El Nino events dissipate by the following spring. They set in the fall or the winter and then continue for a few months and then dissipate. This one, though, shows some longevity. So it's one of the most important tools that the long lead forecasters have, even though again, it's limited. And the skill of these outlooks, and we look ahead, especially as we go into next year, a lot of those are based on long-term time trends too. So it's a tough thing to do, and I won't say take it with a grain of salt, but it's good, I think, to try and inform ourselves and at least keep it in the back of our mind. But it certainly doesn't have anywhere near the skill or accuracy that we would in a short-term time frame for our weather forecast.
Right. One other thing I hear a lot from golf course superintendents that I talk to is the extremes, whether it's extremely cold or extremely warm or extremely wet. Is that, we talked about a little bit before we started the broadcast, something that is accurate, or is that just kind of the general feeling among people, or has it become more extreme over the past 5, 10, 15 years?
Really, actually, a very important question, because, of course, those extremes are the ones that the impacts, which many of us really care about, they're strongly associated with those. It depends on the variable, though, and in some types of extremes, ironically, we mentioned cold extremes for the winter. Those are decreasing. The really cold temperatures, at least in terms of frequency and severity, we're seeing decreases with time, significant decreases towards milder temperatures. Don't see much on the high end for temperatures, but I think maybe the most important one of all is precip. And unquestionably, we are seeing an increase in the number of heavy precipitation events. And overall, if we look at the last roughly 50 years, half century, in Michigan, we've added, depending on location, again, somewhere on the order of 10 to 15% more precip now on average than we had a half a century ago. That translates to 3 to 4 inches. And most of you appreciate 3 to 4 inches is typically what we get in a summer month for precip. So in essence, you're adding a whole extra month of precip into your annual precipitation cycle. The distribution of that, the change, the temporal trend it's been fairly, it's in all seasons, but it's been more in the cold season than it has been in the warm. But we have seen increases in virtually all of those seasons. But how you get more annual precipitation, there's also more wet days than used to be the case. That's also increased. But the big increase, if you actually look at the amounts and the totals of that 3 to 4 inches, most of it is in large precip events. And if we look, I have a grad student right now working on a project with these heavy precip events and movement of nitrogen, actually, in the landscape. And there's definitely a correlation. But the numbers of those have increased, both the magnitude of these heavy events. Think about, we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the horrible flooding rain event in the Keweenaw Peninsula last Father's Day of 2018. We had another one of these events in February of last year of 2018. We've seen several of these where we get 3, 4, 5 inches. In Houghton, for example, for last year, they had 7 inches of rain in 12 hours, which is, it not only broke a new record, but it just shattered the record. these events, unfortunately, are becoming more common. So in terms of extremes, if you were going to point at one, there's no question. I think that's the most significant or the most important one. And if we look at economic impact across the board for everybody, and from flooded basements to killed turf or flooded turf, that's the number one. And that trend is something I think we all, it shows no sign of slowing down. 2018 on average was the new wettest year on record in Michigan as an average. So that's the one that gets the most attention.
2018 was the wettest one on record?
As averaged over the entire state, that was the new wettest year on record, going back back to the late 19th century. So well over 100 years.
Which is amazing, because last year all we talked about was how dry it was, and people couldn't keep their rough alive, and it was hot. But that kind of goes back to that extreme. It seems like it's either incredibly hot and dry or incredibly wet and cold.
Right.
And no kind of nice ramp up. It seems like we're kind of stuck in this eternal spring right now. Everybody's kind of wondering when summer's going to get here, and we're already, almost halfway through June.
Yeah.
So hopefully that we tip, as you said, it was kind of a 50-50 shot on whether it's going to stay this way or get a little more normal. So hopefully we tip towards the warm.
But it is, as the forecast guidance suggests, it isn't going to be, certainly in the short term. We're stuck with more of the same. It's, at least for the next couple of weeks, it's very difficult. It's very, very abnormal or unusual to see an upper air pattern now persist, especially during a transitional season, either spring or fall. Those are the seasons we see the most change. In the summer and in the winter, in those stable seasons, it isn't atypical to see a pattern go 3 or 4 weeks. But those are stable seasons, not the transition where we're moving from warm to cold or cold to warm, which is why, again, this year it just can't keep saying how unusual it is.
Yeah. Well, that's why we put together this turf chat. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
No, but we certainly are hoping for a change. And if you play the statistics and so forth again, it's the further we go with this continuation, just the more rare it becomes. And sooner or later, we are going to shift. And I guess the one last thing, it could be a number of some of those years that, again, in the past, the analogs are no forecast, but we've seen both a continuation of wetter than normal after those springs, but we also have gone to the opposite. So it's not helpful, and our outlook doesn't indicate that, but it has happened in the past.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we get an Indian summer and have some warm weather, or people get out and golf well into October and November, because we kind of lost that last year as well. So hopefully it all evens out and we get some people out there playing golf, and our members can let the golf carts get back out, which I know has been an issue this spring. So thank you very much, Dr. Andresen. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hopefully next time we talk to you, it'll be about this nice, normal, warm weather pattern that we had for the rest of the summer.
I think we'd all enjoy that. Something normal. Thanks.
Thanks very much for your time.
You bet.